Americans have been slickly persuaded that the entire subject of money is much too complicated for them. Few subjects have been made to appear more tangled, more confused than money. Most of our citizens become so involved in arguing over various governmental money policies, tight money versus easy money, high interest rates versus low interest rates, and so on, that they lose sight of what money really is. Until one understands the primary economics of money, he will be hopelessly confused in attempting to understand the sophisticated convolutions of those international economic events about which we are hearing so much and which so vitally concern each of us. Thousands of commodities have at one time or another served as money. Things such as tobacco in colonial Virginia, copper in ancient Egypt, beads, nails, tea, fishhooks, even cigarettes. As every school child learns, the first trading was done by barter, trading one good for another. When a man found he couldn't trade directly for what he wanted, he might trade for something else, and in turn trade that good for the desired product. Individuals thus accepted commodities in trade which they didn't intend to use personally, so long as they were confident such goods could ultimately be traded for something useful. Money, then, has been from ancient days a commodity with inherent value that is accepted in exchange by individuals who intend to trade it for something else. As commerce developed, two precious metals, gold and silver, gained worldwide prominence as the two most useful money commodities. This did not happen because some tribal legislature decreed it, or because of the arbitrary whim of a king, but because gold and silver were so valuable, for reasons inherent in their use, that one could be sure there would always be a demand for them. No one ever had to fear that his gold or silver might suddenly become worthless. They are called precious metals for a good reason. Gold and silver are inherently valuable, and not about to go out of favor with the world's population. If you own gold or silver, it will never be worthless, since there is a ready industrial market for both commodities. Okay? So why do we think of money as being pieces of paper? Because, simply, men of commerce need a convenient method of handling and conveying gold and silver. Warehouses, the forerunners of modern-day banks, were at first used to store gold conveniently and safely. An individual who paid to have his gold stored at such a warehouse would receive a receipt, a claim check on his gold, just as when you store your valuable automobile in a parking lot and get a claim check which you present to claim that automobile when you return. Soon commercial interests found it more convenient to trade these receipts than to cart the gold about the countryside. The receipts, of course, were valuable only because the gold was readily available at the warehouse. As the receipt system became more complicated, it became easier and more tempting for some warehousemen to attempt to use it to their financial advantage. For example, one might easily issue more receipts than its gold stock would justify. When an extensive breach was suspected, the warehouse customers would rush to turn in their receipts and withdraw their gold. Thus the well-known run on the bank, with those last in line losing their savings. Well, governments have always taken an interest in money and banking, often supported by unscrupulous bankers who have made enormous profits through alliance with politicians. Governments have throughout history realized that when you control the money, you control the people. To control that money, politicians developed legal tender laws, providing that a government's receipts, or paper money, must be accepted in payment of any debt or obligation, no matter how much or how little individuals may value such markers. Thus, politicians have nearly always sought to have citizens think in terms of their own national money, such as American dollars, French francs, or German marks, rather than in terms of that universal money which is gold or silver. This permits the government's credits to be substituted for the precious metal, enabling them to hold less bullion than the face value of certificates outstanding, inflating the currency by the deficit, that is, making it worth less in terms of the reserved gold. Legal tender, not backed by gold or silver, is backed only by the glitter of the promises of politicians, opening the door to total inflation. such as total worthlessness of the government currency as expressed in terms of gold or silver. Nearly every government in history has eventually given in to the temptation to start printing paper money only thinly backed by gold. They have paid bills with these fraudulent receipts, and citizens have accepted them because of the legal tender laws. Inevitably, such governments are tempted to further inflate the currency and spend themselves into destruction by printing so much unbacked paper money that the nation's currency becomes worthless. This prompts individuals to seek to exchange their paper money for real gold. Historically, governments have responded by confiscating all gold and making it a crime for private individuals to own gold bullion. This happened in the United States in 1934. Since our government seeks to pay its bills with unbacked printing press money, it naturally doesn't want people to think of money as a commodity, gold and silver, which only serves as a medium of exchange. Such inflationary governments as ours thus promote two common definitions of money. First, money is said to be the medium of exchange, and second, money is described only as the representation of wealth. In 1933, William Gow wisely defined money as follows, quote, "Money is not merely the representation of prosperity. Money of gold and silver is property, is wealth. $100 in silver can no more be considered as the representative of $100 worth of flour than $100 of flour can be considered as representative of $100 worth of iron. Each is the equivalent of the other, but each is real wealth, not a mere symbol of wealth." End quote. You see, gold and silver money functions successfully as a medium of exchange because they are real wealth. In order to saddle America and other countries with the collectivism and governmental power bred of control of their total national wealth through total control of their money and its supply, the international communist conspiracy and its insiders early sought a rationale for substituting paper for our real money. This rationale was found in the works of John Maynard Keynes, English economist and member of the Fabian Socialist Society, who boasted that his theories would prove the euthanasia of capitalism. Keynes' schemes have now been palmed off on 2 generations as the new economics. Since Lord Keynes' use of state control to manipulate the economy was called new, most Americans, curiously superstitious about economists, didn't compare it with old failures. But there was little that was new in the new economics, except for its bags of pseudo-scientific terminology. It provided nearly the same tortured rationalizations for divesting economic sovereignty from the individual citizen, which had been the trump of demagogues and tyrants since long before Joseph's economics helped to bring the Pharaoh to fury and Egypt to ruin. As the economist Henry Hazlitt has said in his point-by-point dissection of Keynes' general theory of employment, interest, and money, quote, "I have been unable to find in it a single important doctrine that is both true and original. What is original in the book is not true, and what is true is not original. In fact, even much that is fallacious in the book is not original." End quote. Nevertheless, the Keynesian theory has become the dominant economic hocus-pocus of our age, and has been praised and adopted by such political luminaries as Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson. And Richard Nixon himself has identified himself as a Keynesian. It has totally wrecked the economics of most of Africa and half of Latin America. It has kept the underdeveloped nations underdeveloped, and it has been used to con the American people into exporting socialism through such horrors as the Alliance for Progress. Bankrupt Britain is a good example of applied Keynesianism. The monetary policy of the new economics is essentially an elaborate form of the ancient monarchistic practice of coin clipping. It requires planned inflation, studied manipulation of the economy using printing press paper money, the product of intentionally planned deficits. The Keynesian argument is a con game based on the theory that by the time scheduled inflation catches up with its perpetrators, the country fair will be over and the bumpkin will be too confused, embarrassed, or stupid to call the sheriff. The idea of spending our way to prosperity is certainly appealing to the foolish, ignorant, or naive, as is any idea that one can dance without ever having to pay the piper. The New Economics propounds the theory that the government planners can assure perpetual prosperity by managing the nation's economy. If the need is to pep things up, planners put printing press money in circulation through government spending programs financed by deficit, exchanging public spending for private spending and buying votes. When the economy overheats, as the planners describe inflation, the government will theoretically cut spending and raise taxes and interest rates. In practice, the Keynesian theories have proven to be all acceleration and no brake. The politicians want to keep on buying votes with government spending and avoid the unpopular methods of heightened taxes and interest rates, which in theory are used to cool off the overheated economy. Therefore, in practice, the spending goes on and on and on to disaster. Whether taxes go up or down, government spending increases, deficits are theorized as beneficial, and inflation steals from the people until the economy crumbles. Well, so much for government money management. America's widely discussed adverse balance of payments is another matter confusing to many of our citizens. What that phrase means is that we are sending more dollars abroad than foreigners spend on U.S. goods. Two basic factors cause the adverse balance of trade, and both are the responsibility of a government which is selling out the American economy. First, costly military and foreign aid, and second, domestic inflation. Our private balance of trade is in our favor. That is, the American economy continues to produce more goods for sale abroad than are imported for American needs. If exports that are subsidized by the government under the foreign and military aid programs were deducted from the so-called surplus, the imbalance would most likely disappear. In short, the gold drain which is bankrupting us is of the making of Congress and the administration which continues to tax America to pour our wealth abroad. Foreign aid, including interest on the money we have borrowed to give away, costs the American people billions of dollars each year. The foreign aid program has been fragmentized to hide the vast total of the bill from the people. This aid flows from 16 different spigots, and each year Congress is asked in more than a dozen items of proposed legislation to increase the spending of the dispensing agencies. And the public is generally only aware of the President's annual request for appropriations under the Foreign Assistance Act. Domestic inflation, the declining purchasing power of the dollar resulting from deficit spending and the inflated supply of money, further inflames the balance of payments problem as our high dollar costs of production are pricing American goods out of the markets of the world. Inflation makes U.S. goods seem less attractive to foreigners and foreign goods more attractive to U.S. consumers. Our balance of payments deficits have been financed in part by the payment of gold to foreigners and in part by the increase of our indebtedness to foreigners. In order to encourage other nations not to bring in all their dollars as gold claims, we are paying high interest rates on dollar holdings as a bribe not to claim the gold, which they are doing anyway. Our dollars are being held for ransom by people to whom we gave them as foreign aid. And still, our balance of payments deficit is rising faster than a rocket. Is the government going to do something about it? You bet. Penalize the private citizen. While our government forbids its citizens to invest their money in countries where it can be used productively to earn a return and strengthen our balance of payments, it taxes the same citizen and gives away their funds as aid to irresponsible socialist and even communist governments, where they produce no offsetting earnings to help our payments balance. The only way the United States can solve the problem is to plug the dollar leaks by halting inflation through ending deficit spending at home, stopping the bulk of foreign aid, and freeing restrictions on the private economy. To do otherwise will only make the problem worse while permitting the leaders of our government to accrue further dictatorial economic powers. Well, what about paper gold? Rather than face reality, the government is looking to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to pull its chestnuts out of the fire. Rather than throw off the garments of Keynesianism that produced the imbalance of payments, a patch is proposed in the form of paper gold to make the crisis wearable for another year or two or so. The amazing thing is that nobody guffaws at the incredible idea that there could be such a thing as paper gold. This paper gold is an International Monetary Fund scheme to take the form of special drawing rights, referred to as SDRs. International bureaucrats naturally call the SDRs the most significant development in international financial cooperation in many years. According to the SDR plan, nations having financial difficulties would be able to borrow some foreign currencies. Borrowing limits are to be based on each nation's IMF quota, which in turn is based on gold. It is doubtful the SDRs will ever come into serious use. The only countries enthusiastic about the scheme are America and Britain, two countries which are both broke and seeking relief as a result of their own easily remedied inflationary lunacy. While ignorant college professors, one-world liberals, and other emotionally retarded souls may be all a-twitter about a fool's gold currency, those countries with serious claims on our gold are not in the least interested. Not at least until after the last raiding party has left Fort Knox as empty as Mother Hubbard's cupboard. The SDRs are only a gimmick, more paper money which will eventually have to be paid off in hard metallic gold. But the witch doctor monetary planners would have you believe they have invented some kind of a magic potion to allow us to ease our balance of payments and permit everybody to borrow from everybody else with nobody ever being expected to pay. Well, that is not the way things happen in the real world. In order to extricate ourselves from the loss of our entire gold supply, America must devalue the dollar. Such a devaluation can be accomplished by raising the price of gold. In 1968, the U.S. government admitted there were claims of $44 billion outstanding against $11 billion in gold reserves, $33 billion held by foreign countries, and $11 billion needed to back our currency. Those familiar with such devious economic learnings as elementary arithmetic will immediately note that the United States government is bankrupt, that we need many times as much gold as we have on hand to meet our obligations. The only way the United States can protect itself is to repudiate its obligations, not directly, but in the time-honored way that all governments in this same position have taken. We move to raise the price of gold, which we did. Our government employed a legal maneuver which said to its creditors, "We formally agreed to give you 1/35 of an ounce of gold for each piece of paper you have upon which we printed the words $1. We have just passed a law which says we will now give you 1/35 of an ounce of gold for every 4 pieces of paper you have upon which we printed the words $1. We thus raised the price of gold 4 times the old price of $35 per ounce to $140 per ounce, and suddenly our $11 billion in gold becomes worth $44 billion, and we are no longer broke." In government circles, this is called devaluation of the dollar. In business, it would be called defrauding your creditors, or repudiation of debts. It's a nasty business. Official denials that a currency will be devalued are usually most vehement just before the event. This is done to stop the creditors from engaging in a run on the bank, and the politicians justify their lying as being in the public interest. Every time a foreign nation devalues and America does not follow suit, we lose. An ounce of gold is worth more Rasbukniks, or whatever the devalued currency is called, but it is still worth only so many American dollars. Thus, it pays to get U.S. gold to trade in the market where the price of Rasbukniks makes goods cheap. The immediate practical effect of, say, British devaluation in terms of our dollar is to change the relative price of things for buyers in the two countries. A British car selling for £1,000 sterling formerly cost a U.S. buyer $2,800. After devaluation, the car cost $2,400. A U.S. car selling for $2,800 formerly cost the British buyer £1,000, but after devaluation, the car cost £1,160 sterling. Well, this stimulates British exports to America and limits American exports to England. Like our own politicians, Prime Minister Harold Wilson in 1967 refused to acknowledge the real causes of Great Britain's balance of payments problems, which forced devaluation. Mr. Wilson blamed the chance of world events and successive waves of speculation against sterling. In other words, those who were attempting to protect themselves against losses that would result from devaluation. He did not mention his party's continuous pursuit of inflationary and socialist policies, which had debilitated any competitive advantage of British industry and left England's international finances in shambles. The wages of socialism are devaluation, unemployment, and financial chaos. The Keynesian socialist's planned inflation leads always to heightened government controls and new infringements on the economic liberty of any people afflicted with it. America's gold outflow, devaluation, orbiting national debt, and increases in the cost of living are all largely products of inflation. Yet inflation is as misunderstood by the public as is money. Most of our citizens mistakenly blame inflation on the so-called wage price spiral, which is merely another effect of inflation, not its cause. No, inflation is produced simply and only by an artificial increase in the supply of fiat money in circulation. If there were no artificial increase in the volume of money circulating, it would be physically impossible to have a general wage price spiral. You can't fill a quart glass with a pint of milk. In order to understand inflation and how it increases the prices you must pay at the store, imagine the economy as an auction. If suddenly everybody at the auction is given more paper money to spend, this does not increase the amount of goods for sale. The buyers with more paper money to spend simply bid up the price of those goods available. And so it is as the growing amounts of phony, unbacked paper money circulate through our economy, which in itself is simply a giant auction with millions of buyers and sellers. It is much easier to understand inflation when it is called by its true name, counterfeiting. For all inflation amounts to is the printing of counterfeit currency for which there is no real money, that's gold or silver, no real money supporting its value. If you try this personally, they will put you in a crowbar motel when they catch you. But when the administration does it, it is the new economics. Instead of being a crime, it is lauded by the pseudo-intellectuals and conspirators promoting our economic ruin as priming the economy. Well, who makes up the loss? Those whose incomes will not go up as a result of the inflation, most notably widows, pensioners, holders of life insurance policies, savers, and those Americans who are on fixed incomes, the very people politicians forever claim to be helping. The government inflates the money supply partially by printing Federal Reserve notes, the currency you carry in your wallet. But the bulk of it comes through a mere sophisticated way of doing the same thing. Our government has a euphemism for counterfeiting called deficit spending. The deficits, increases in our national debt, are turned into credit, money, through the use of bonds and treasury notes. While it seems incredible that intelligent people would adopt a system based on debt money, in which the more money the government spends, the more it has, that is precisely what it amounts to. In 1959, when he was Secretary of the Treasury, liberal establishmentarian Robert B. Anderson bluntly spelled out the techniques of inflation. He stated, quote, "Now suppose I wanted to write checks of $100 million starting tomorrow morning, but the Treasury was out of money. If I called up a bank and said, 'Will you loan me $100 million at 3.5% for 6 months if I send you over a note to that effect?' Well, the banker would probably say, 'Yes, I will.' Well, where would he get the $100 million we wish to credit to the account of the U.S. Treasury? Would he take it from the account of someone else? No, certainly not. He would merely create that much money, subject to reserve requirements, by crediting our account in that sum and accepting the government's note as an asset. When I have finished writing checks for $100 million, the operation would have added that sum of money to the money supply." End quote. Anderson went on to admit that this would be the same as calling the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and saying, "Hey, fellas, please print me up $100 million worth of greenbacks, which I can pay out tomorrow." Anderson and his conspiratorial predecessors and successors have, needless to say, made an enormous number of such calls to friendly bankers during the past decades. And there can be little doubt that they know precisely what they are doing to our economy. Such irrepressible spenders have, in fact, more than quadrupled the money supply since 1940, producing a wage-price spiral which has shrunk the purchasing power of the 1940 dollar to less than 35 cents. Actually, our purchasing power would have been shrunk to a mere 25 cents with the quadrupling of the money, except that our increase in productivity has somewhat offset the effects of the inflation forced upon us by the far left. It has been calculated that if the next 30 years produce a duplication of the past 30 years, the year 2000 will find the federal debt increased to $6 trillion. What then would be the cost of a loaf of bread? How good would be the retirement features of your permanent life insurance policy? Of course, these questions are purely academic. At the current rate of inflation, our economy will collapse into the hands of the insiders long before the year 2000. When inflation reaches a rate of 4 and 5% a year, it begins to feed on itself, as people rush to buy things they want before the price becomes prohibitive. If allowed to continue, this vicious circle can only result in the kind of runaway inflation experienced by Germany in 1923, when postage stamps to mail a letter cost 1 billion marks. When the runaway inflation being forced on America reaches its peak, you may be able to cash in your life insurance policy for enough to buy a hamburger at McDonald's. Lenin contended that the United States could be forced to spend itself into a revolutionary crisis. He stated, quote, "The best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency," end quote. Lord Keynes understood this principle, and on page 235 of his book, Consequences of Peace, he even quoted Lenin on destroying capitalism through debauching the currency. And since it was Keynes who popularized the current practice of inflating our national currency, few reasonable men will doubt that Keynes and his more intelligent apostles in our government have known very well what they are promoting. The administration's answer to our fiscal problem is not to cut spending, but to shift the burden for its own guilt to the private citizen through an increase in taxes. And this is nothing less than a barefaced attempt to transfer more purchasing power from the hands of the American people to their ever more powerful big government. The insiders running our government have pumped billions of dollars of stage money into our economy and now seek to make a desperate show of avoiding the inevitable consequences. Increasing our taxes while continuing expansive monetary policy is so far from a solution that it can only be called criminal neglect or outright treason. It is like applying the brakes on a speeding automobile while pressing the accelerator to the floor. You don't do it unless you're intentionally trying to destroy the automobile. In 1968, the reasons given Congress for removing the gold cover, our last restraint against total destruction of the dollar, and the consequent economic holocausts were: 1. A 25-cent gold backing for every paper dollar is outmoded. 2. Repeal of the backing is necessary to maintain world confidence in the dollar. 3. Such a move will prove to the world that we will redeem all dollars at $35 an ounce. And 4. We can't print any more pocket cash if the cover is not removed. Of course, what a refusal to remove the backing meant was that the annual multi-billion inflationary increase in currency would have to be stopped. It would have to be stopped because if we persisted in requiring a 25% backing in gold, we couldn't print any more of this phony currency for lack of gold. And this meant that the government would have to stop inflating by fiat currency. And no wonder the Treasury Secretary was so extremely eager to drop the 25% gold backing. Fowler's words to the Banking Committee amount to this: "Fellows, we are going over the cliff anyway, but if we free the gold, it won't be quite so soon." Well, if gold is outmoded, as Mr. Fowler and the New Economics boys contend, why does every country in the world, except the United States, of course, want it? Why are the other nations of the world attacking our outmoded gold supplies? If gold was outmoded, why weren't American citizens allowed to own it? The idea of gold as outmoded is simply ludicrous. Russia, for example, mines gold at a cost of $105 an ounce and uses it in world trade. The late Major George Racy Jordan, who during World War II headed our primary base for shipping Lend-Lease equipment to Russia, claimed that during the war, large amounts of American gold mining equipment from closed California mines were shipped to the Soviets. Russia knows, even if we do not, that gold mining equipment is war material. You can't fight a war without gold. The real world is run by the golden rule. He who has gold rules. The present spate of zooming interest rates, restrictive money policies, speculation, and stock volume draw a frighteningly close parallel to the year 1929. The addition of our immense private debt and orbiting government deficits could combine in the tumble to guarantee one of history's most devastating financial debacles. Still, it seems as if only a few people, those who read and study the works of free market economists like Professor Ludwig von Mises, Henry Hazlitt, F.A. Harper, and Professor Hans Sennholz, only a few people are aware of what is in store for the world economy. The rest, including the vast majority of bankers, stockbrokers, and businessmen, are in their ignorance supremely confident that everything is as splendid as the perpetual prosperity predicted by Herbert Hoover just before the stock market crash of 1929. As the highly authoritative American Institute for Economic Research asks, quote, "How does it happen that supposedly responsible men in positions of great public trust have permitted this nation to approach international insolvency? If treason in high places is not the explanation, then the situation must be attributable to ignorance or disregard of principles." End quote. Of course, our economy is the producer of incredible wealth, but the economy belongs to private individuals, not to the government. The government would have to seize the entire economy if it wanted to use it to back the dollar, and that is called communism, friend. Maybe you knew it all along. Also, it is not the gross that counts, it is the net. The richest, most productive person in the world can go broke if year after year he spends more than he produces. And someday such a man's banker will say, "We realize you are the most productive man in the world, but buddy, you are broke, and we want our money." In other words, gross productivity has nothing to do with solvency. Creditors are not interested in romantic stories about what you are worth, but what you can pay. America's creditors are nervous, and they know it will be first come, first served. The really amazing thing about all of this is not that it is happening, terrible as the repercussions will be. We are, after all, by now all too used to seeing America sold out by the establishmentarians of the far left. What is incredible is that there has been next to no informed protest about it from the American business community. To find out why, we set out to get some idea of the depth of knowledge of elemental free market economics possessed by America's bankers, stockbrokers, and insurance men, those who most often give financial advice to American families. With the help of hard-working volunteers, we polled several thousand such gentlemen, asking 15 key questions about basic economics. Since most Americans under 50 have had their training in economics from Keynesians, it is not surprising that the financial advisors we queried were confused. But Lord help the family accepting financial advice from the vast majority of these people. The small percentage who are well informed are aware of the gross ignorance of their colleagues and are as disturbed about the matter as we are. Here's how bad it is among the financial experts. Less than 10% of the financial advisors we contacted were familiar with the works of Professor Ludwig von Mises, the greatest living free market economist. Less than 10% knew that communist spy Harry Dexter White had been largely responsible for setting up the International Monetary Fund, and only 1/4 of the stockbrokers opposed the IMF's paper gold proposals. Although almost 60% of the polled financial advisors regard themselves as conservative, only 25% of the stockbrokers we queried opposed removing the gold backing of the dollar. Only about 1/4 of those in all categories understand that the massive government interference in the economy makes a depression more probable. all of which proves that even in the world of finance, the majority just doesn't understand the system. If you can keep your head while those about you are losing theirs, you can protect yourself in the oncoming crisis. There are a number of things you can do. First, you can religiously hoard silver coins, which now have an intrinsic value over 3 times their face value. Even though they sell at a premium, they are an excellent investment against both short-term inflation and the long-term inflation which we expect to end in hyperinflationary explosion. Also, it is legal to own gold coins. If one chooses to play it safe, he stands an excellent chance of having his loss of interest made up in the increase in the value of such coins. Silver bullion can be purchased on the New York spot market and take possession. But investors should be wary of the vastly overextended silver futures market, which would probably be closed in the case of a monetary crisis. Safety-minded investors may also wish to investigate various ways of buying silver bullion on the London Metals Exchange through the Swiss banks. Even should the stock market sink beneath the waves, gold and silver stocks will go in the opposite direction when the hyperinflation hits and people panic into hard money. After the market bottoms out, bargain basement prices will be available to those who were judicious enough to protect their savings before the crisis hit. This was done in the 30s by such people as Kennedy, Baruch, and Morgenthau. The new economics have been used by our politicians to paint America into a corner from which we cannot escape without getting paint all over us. While we don't have to kick over the bucket, even the proper type of devaluation followed by elimination of our deficit balance of payments would still produce serious inflation. And that will be the least price we will have to pay for the actions of our money manipulators in government. The other choices are both likely and more expensive. The exact time of the crisis is, of course, impossible to foretell. If European countries can be conned or pressured into accepting the paper gold SDRs, the collapse could be postponed for perhaps several years. However, it can only be a postponement. There is a sign over the entrance to the Notre Dame locker room which says, quote, "When the going gets tough, the tough get going," end quote. America's enemies hope that the reality of our impending economic crisis will cause you to panic and hide. But God gave you a backbone, not a wishbone, and as the man said, this is it. You'd better get tough, and you'd better get smart. As tragic as the future is going to be for the cocktail party set which has not had time to find out what is going on in America, our nation will survive. Either the shock will help those of us who love our country to return her to a position as an incredibly prosperous nation where free men live by free trade, or we will all be slaves in a communist tyranny brought on by economic collapse, foreign entanglements, civil war in our cities, and the enactment of totalitarian emergency executive powers that will never be lifted. The choice depends on whether Americans are still tough and whether the tough get going. Thank you very much.